Let's start our first unit in psychology. Basically, what we're going to be looking at here is the very beginning intro of psych and talking about what it is and how it's a science and so forth. So, first of all, I'll show you for each unit that we have during the course of the semester, you will have a reading list. And so in this reading list, it always tells you what's assigned. Now, these are things you are supposed to read without question. You'll have questions and things from there. Obviously, if you find something in the book that something else that you like, go ahead and read it, but you're not required. You won't be directly given questions unless we've covered it in class or in notes. But these things you definitely will have questions even if we don't talk about what's in the book in class. Okay? Now, let's talk real quick about what is psychology. Many of you have taken this class. Some of you may know or not know for sure exactly what you're getting into. A lot of people think that psychology is the study of the mind. Well, that's partially correct, but if you simply say that it's the study of the mind, you're not totally accurate. Okay? We're going to say that psychology is the science and study of human and animal behaviors and experiences. Okay, the science and study of human and animal behaviors and experiences. So that includes a lot more than just the mind. Now, are there things in the mind that may cause us to behave in a certain way? Maybe a positive attitude or a negative attitude that that indicates or kind of controls how we respond in a situation? Sure, there are. There are cultural factors, there are biological factors, there's a number. There might even be genetic factors as to why we do the things we do. So we're going to look at all of those types of things as we go through the semester. Now, you noticed in the definition we said it's the science and study of. Basically, psychology is a science, okay, without question. We consider it a science. But it's not the same as what you may be thinking of, okay? When you think of science, you tend to think of like biology or chemistry or physics. Those are the things that you tend to think of as science classes. Well, those are natural sciences. Natural sciences. If you mix two chemicals together and they explode on Monday, then if you do the same thing on Tuesday, they're going to explode again. And on Wednesday and Thursday and Friday, they're going to do the same thing. Social sciences, that's what psychology is part of. Social sciences look at human beings and their behavior and interactions. And if you put two people together on Monday, they may treat each other totally different than if you put them together on Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday or Friday. So we cannot guarantee how people are going to respond. That's why we look at what we call generalizations of behavior. We're going to generalize and say most people, given these scenarios, are going to respond in certain ways. So we're not as exact with our results, but that doesn't mean that we're not a science. Okay? What determines, what bases psychology as being a science is that we use the scientific method of research. We follow the same guidelines that all of the natural sciences do. If you have done a chemistry experiment in class and you follow certain procedures, well, then you've already been through the scientific methods of research. And that's what we use as well to study human behavior. So it's different than just common sense. Sometimes people say, psychology is nothing more than common sense. Well, that's not true. Let me give you an example. Research. Recent research indicates that ice cream consumption and homicides, or murders, are positively correlated. What that means is that as ice cream consumption goes up, homicides or murders go up. As ice cream consumption decreases, homicides decrease. Now, if you looked at that in an unscientific way, a lot of people would say, oh my gosh, I better not eat a whole lot of ice cream because I don't want a whole lot of murders to take place. Some people would look at that and say, okay, one thing's causing the other. That's not the case at all. We're going to explain this and go through how this works. Okay, it's called correlation, but basically there could be any number of factors that come into play here. For example, when is ice cream consumption the highest? Probably during the summer months when temperatures are increased. Well, homicides, okay? Homicides tend to occur more frequently during the summer and hot months. Maybe the homicides are more linked to the temperature because, for example, people may get short-tempered when they're out in the heat all day and they're tired and fatigued and they react in ways that they might not otherwise. So, it's a whole different ballgame. So there's a lot of other factors, a lot of other things that we look at. But the scientific methods of research are what we're going to be able to use to keep track of and make good scientific judgments on whether or not things are actually related or one thing causes another. Now, let's look at the goals of psychology. When we talk about the goals, there's basically 4 goals that we're going to look at. All semester long, we're going to try and describe behavior. One thing you have to be able to do is see, kind of examine and say, okay, what type of behavior does exist? And then we're going to try to figure out the cause of that behavior. If we can do that, we're going to try and predict it. And then in the future, maybe we can learn to control behavior. So basically, we're talking about 4 goals of psychology, and that is to describe, explain, predict, and control behavior. Now let's take a look at the history, very brief history of psychology. And what's interesting to note is, we're not the first group of people to ever ask the question, why do people do the things they do? That question's been around a long time. In fact, if you look even back in the Stone Age, people would sit around a campfire and one guy would look at another and he'd go, and what that means in Stone Ageese is, why is that guy behaving the way he is? I don't get it. And so they were trying to explain behavior. Now, how did they explain it? They explained it by evil spirits, good and evil spirits. Okay, you can see the example here of this guy with a hole in his head. Okay, in the Stone Age, basically, if somebody was misbehaving or behaving in a very wild, strange way, something was wrong with them. Okay, people wanted to help them, so their friends, they would try to alleviate this. So their method, they believed that there was an evil spirit that had taken over the person. They would drill a hole in their head to allow the evil spirit to escape. Now, I say drill loosely because during the Stone Age, basically that meant they'd take a big rock, sharp rock, and they'd crash in their skull. That was designed to allow the evil spirit to escape. And what's interesting is this did work because people became much more mellow after this therapy. So that now, unfortunately, some people did die, but you have to understand it wasn't because they were hit over the head with a large stone or boulder. It was because the evil spirit was so mean that it just held on and killed the person. Okay, so that was way back in the Stone Age. The Egyptians, they got a little bit more philosophical on this. They believed in Ka. Now, Ka was this little guy inside you that basically controlled you kind of like a puppet. He controlled your thoughts and actions and so forth. And the thing is, they had proof. They had proof of Ka's existence. Sometime here in the near future, somebody that you know well, I want you to ask them to allow you to look deeply into their eyes. And if you look deeply into somebody's eyes, you will see Ka. Ka will be looking back at you. Basically, they were seeing their own reflection, but they didn't realize that. So they believed that that was that little guy inside of them. Now, it was kind of interesting because sooner or later somebody got the bright idea and said, well, if Ka controls my behavior, who controls Ka? And they thought about that for a while, and they finally decided, well, that was easy. Ka number 2. Ka number 2 is a little bitty guy who lives inside of Ka number 1. And Ka number 2 controls Ka number 1, who controls you. And of course, the same thing kept going. Ka number 3 controls 2, 4 controls 3, 5 controls 4, and so on, until you got to Ka number 7. And then 7 was kind of a sacred number to the Egyptians. So you just don't ask about Ka number 7. That was not polite. Now, obviously, these are not very scientific approaches, but we get on to the 1700s and what's known as phrenology. Phrenology, believe it or not, was the study of bumps on a person's head, on their skull. They would feel around on a person's skull. And the idea here was that if you had a lump or a big bump on your skull, well, then the only logical reason for that was your brain must be bigger in that area because it pushed out your skull. And so let's say that you are really good at doing math and you have a bump in a certain spot on your skull, then that must be the area of your brain that, math is done in. And so the whole idea, they had the entire brain mapped out in terms of what parts of the brain did what things. Now, they were totally 100% inaccurate, but they didn't know that at the time. So that's phrenology. Let's go on to the mid-1800s, early 19s. And this, we get a little bit closer to what we'd consider modern-day psych. At the beginning of psychology, basically psychology started in terms of as a science in the 1870s. Wilhelm Wundt, looks like William Wundt, but Wilhelm Wundt started a psych lab in 1879 in Germany. And we consider him to be the father of psychology. Now, in the early days of psych, the question was, well, what do we ask? What are we even looking at in terms of behavior? And so people talked about the mind, and this is where a lot of you may think psychology study of the mind. Back in these days, structuralism, the followers of Wundt, what they wanted to look at was, what is the mind? Where is it? What's it look like? What's the structure? What's it composed of? And so that was their major question. Of course, it was very difficult to answer. Now, they used a technique called introspection. They would ask people to kind of look inside themselves and tell why they did things, and they'd break it down into little bitty miniature parts. Non-scientific by any stretch, but that was the structuralism approach. The key there is they were looking for the structure, or in other words, what the mind looked like, or what it was, where it was. Now, functionalism. Functionalism was a competing school of thought at this time. Functionalism, the word function means purpose. What they looked at was, what is the purpose of the mind? What does the mind do for us? How does it work? What can we accomplish with it? That was the whole idea of functionalism. These are two competing theories in the very early days of psych. Now, the last one that we'll look at real quick, and that's Gestalt psychology. And that Gestalt looked at kind of the whole picture of things, looked at perception, how we perceive things. If you look at this picture here, what do you see? Well, if we break it down into parts, you might see little bitty bits and pieces of black and white. But if you look at the whole picture, you may see a woman's face, or you may see a guy. If you look at the black, you may see a guy playing a musical instrument. So with Gestalt, their expression, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, that was big in terms of Gestalt. They didn't break things down. They looked at the whole picture to get a different perception of things. Okay?